Okay, we're going. We're going. All right, for the folks at home, I'm sorry we started class for a minute. So let me just bring you up to speed. We were talking about Pennsylvania still, and we were mentioning Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was, among other things, an inventor. Benjamin Franklin invented the Franklin stove, a very efficient way of burning wood and keeping the house warm, safer too, than the smoke out. He invented swim fins. He invented the lightning rod, keeping people safe, and he invented bifocals, where one pair of glasses has lenses that can see at a distance and lenses that can see up close. So two different kinds of glasses in one set of spectacles. Then we were talking about him being a statesman, and the definition of statesman is one who speaks on behalf of his own country to other countries. One who speaks on behalf of his own country to other countries. And then we started mentioning what's needed for this. And the big thing is communication. An example I gave of how hard this is the United Nations a number of years ago built a giant computer so that the two superpowers at the time, and that would be the Soviet Union, the Russians, and the United States, the Americans, could speak to each other and hopefully they'd understand each other perfectly and there would be no reason to have a war because they could communicate. So they spent millions of dollars building this giant computer. When it was done, they took the word dog in English, put it in the computer, out popped the word dog in Russian. So they took the word dog in Russian, stuck it in, bing, out popped the word dog in English. It seemed to work. But languages are more complicated than that. And there are expressions that people use. There's an expression in the English language, out of sight, out of mind, which means if it's not in front of you, you're not thinking about it. For example, right now, none of you are thinking about a spotted purple hippopotamus wearing a tutu and holding an umbrella on top of a tightrope. Now you are, because I just put it in front of you. Now it's in sight, it's in mind. But in a minute, that will go away because you'll be thinking about other things that are in front of you. Well, out of sight, out of mind is an important idea. So they took the words, the expression, out of sight, out of mind, meaning if it's not in front of you, you're not thinking about it. They put it in the computer in English. Bing! Out popped Russian words. They took the Russian words, put them back in the computer. Bing! Out popped the words, invisible maniac. Yay! Out of sight, out of mind. Now, does invisible maniac mean the same thing as out of sight, out of mind? Yes. Not at all, but you can see how complicated. Guys, we're not having a running conversation. It gets kind of embarrassing for parents watching at home or whatever. There's things up the guys there. So, out of sight, out of mind doesn't mean the same thing, and this makes it difficult to communicate, particularly in different languages. Okay, so he used those things. He was a printer by trade. He became a very wealthy man, and he was a very learned man. And one of the things he did was when he was a boy, he was working for his brother's print shop, he would set the type. And back then, what that meant was literally had to take a letter out and put it in the printing press, another letter out, put it in the printing press, till he built all of the words. And he actually had to build them backwards, because that's the way a printing press works. So what happened was, somebody would bring in anything, an advertisement, a religious tract, a political tract, whatever. They would bring in a history book. Doesn't matter what was going to be printed. Benjamin Franklin would read it, make sure he understood what he was printing. He would read it again while he selected the letters. He would read it a third time as he made sure his letters were correct. And then he would print one and he would read it a fourth time to make sure that it had printed properly. So everything, no matter what it was, he quickly read 4 times. And that has a tendency to stick in one's mind. So he was a very learned man and just an amazingly brilliant, observant person. It was incredible what this guy picked up on. Let's see here. He wrote a book called Poor Richard's Almanac. Anybody know what an almanac is? What's an almanac, buddy? No. No, you have a sports almanac now. It's not really quite the same thing. Riley, right over. What you're supposed to do during what, honey? It helps with farming. It helps with navigation. For centuries, people have been able to calculate when will sun up be, when will sundown be, when will the tide come in, when will the tide come out. And some of these almanacs could predict weather. It's going to be a cold winter. It's going to be a dry spring. And this was really important for farmers, which most people were, for sailors, which a lot of other people were. And almost every home had an almanac. They didn't have the weather station or the weather channel. They didn't have CNN to turn to or whomever. They didn't have instant information. So they'd buy this book and that would kind of guide them through the year with all this information. And almost every printing house made an almanac because so many people bought them. So lots of people wrote them. However, Benjamin Franklin became very, very wealthy because of his book, Poor Richard's Almanac. Poor Richard was just a made up guy, just a common, ordinary guy, but he was really smart. And in the empty spaces in the almanac, where there was just a little portion of a page that was empty, he would put down some of Poor Richard's wisdom. Anybody know any of those little sayings that came from Benjamin Franklin? A penny saved is a penny earned. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. No, no, apples didn't kill people. No, they didn't. 40 was old, kind of old. It was about a good lifestyle. Maybe 42 in the colonial time. Okay, so he had these little expressions, but he put those in, and now people looked and they said, okay, I could buy Joe's almanac, and it's got all the information I need, but there's nothing extra. There's no kick. Or I could buy Poor Richard's almanac and get all these fun, practical expressions I can teach the kids, tell my neighbors. I'm buying Poor Richard's almanac. So he became very wealthy. And he was what is described as a Renaissance man. And you could have a Renaissance man, you could have a Renaissance woman, you could have call it a Renaissance person. The Renaissance, what it really actually means in French is the rebirth. See what happened, and you don't have to write all this down, just get the idea so you know what we're talking about. There was the Roman age. The Roman Empire, and people could travel freely all around Europe and the Middle East because Rome owned the place. Rome fell. And when Rome fell, people couldn't travel as easily. And because of that, information didn't go as easily. So knowledge kind of stayed and didn't grow much. Matter of fact, a lot of it was lost. And then came the Crusades, that exchange of ideas, not just gold and spices, but also, hey, we kept all this stuff down here in the Middle East that the Romans had learned, and we've added a whole lot to it. And so here's all this wonderful knowledge, and that made its way back to Europe. And there was a rebirth of knowledge. All those wonderful things, art and architecture and sciences, all bloomed. And that was the period of the Renaissance. And a Renaissance person, here comes the definition, a Renaissance person is one who is skilled in many different areas. A Renaissance person is one who is skilled in many different areas, knowledgeable in many different areas. I mean, once in a while, you will run across a person who just knows a whole lot about everything, but it's really hard to be a Renaissance person now. Okay, ready? Take a deep breath. This has been true for quite a while now. All the knowledge, all of it, everything that mankind has learned in the entire history of the world, half of it was discovered in the last 10 years. That's what computers have done. Because information flies around so fast. It used to be the Cha-Cha over here in Milwaukee would do some studies and he'd learn something about plants and then he'd die. And his information about plants might not be turned up or discovered by anybody for decades, maybe never. But now what happens is Annalise makes a discovery about plants and she publishes it on the internet. And then you have James over there living in Tokyo who sees her studies. He's doing something similar, and he takes it to the next level next week. And then he publishes something, and you have Haley who's over here in Copenhagen living, and she reads about that, and she says, oh, wait, this opens up my eyes to something else. And boom, knowledge moves and is gained so much more quickly. Yes, sir. Okay, no, we're not going to a separate conversation. Yes, sir. Can't hear you, hon. I'll say it one more time. Someone who is skilled, knowledgeable in many different areas. Talk to me, bud. Bifocal. 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 Yeah, buddy.
Was Benson married?
He was. He was. Amazingly, he kept, well, he lived a large portion of his life in Europe where he didn't bring his wife with him. Okay. Let's see here. We got that done. I think that takes us through Pennsylvania. So let's shoot on down to Maryland. Okay, we're talking Maryland now. I love Maryland. Love Maryland. When I was in college, my roommate Phil was from Baltimore. Or his dad used to say Baltimore. His dad was from Baltimore. They lived in Maryland. That's where he was from. And we were arguing about who had the better state. Because there was a Winter Olympics going on, and the score at that time of medals was like Russia was in third place, or the Soviet Union was in third place with so many gold medals. This was the Winter Olympics. And then like China was in second place, and Wisconsin was in first place. Because it was the speed skating, and we had the only Olympic training rink. So like, yes, they were really American medals, but everybody was from Milwaukee because they all went down to West Dallas to train. So I said, yeah, okay, we got the whole Olympic team. We got all the medals for the whole country. But he won. He proved to have the better state, at least the more interesting state. Because are you ready for this? When I was in college, not one, not two, not three, but the last 4 governors of Maryland were all in federal prison. Wow. What a state. That's scary, isn't it? Yeah, that's a little bit creepy. Anyway, there was a man who was an advisor to King Charles II. Remember, King Charles II liked Catholics. He didn't become a Catholic until on his deathbed, but while he was king, he liked Catholics. They saved him. Well, one of those Catholic lords, who was a good friend of his, was a man by the name of Sir George Calvert, whose title was Lord Baltimore. Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, was openly Catholic. He was an advisor to the king, one of the key advisors to the king, and he said, yeah, I'm just Catholic. That's just all there is to it. I'm not going to try to apologize. And the Anglican lords didn't like that this Catholic guy was such an important advisor to the king. And so they forced the king to get rid of him. But the king said, oh, you've done me such a good service. He said, everybody look up here. I'll give you this as a proprietorship. I'll give you this thing, Maryland. Now, Maryland has like the worst of all the states to try to draw. Because, man, it's a lot of crazy coast. But it was a good and productive colony, and Sir George Calvert's idea was to make this a home for Catholics. You had the Puritans up here, you had the Quakers over there. These groups that were not particularly welcome in England by the Anglicans were finding places to go over in the New World. So Sir George Calvert, he said, okay, I'll accept that. Thank you. He actually went back to his estates in Ireland. He never went to the New World. He had a son to help him out with that. Okay, boys, stand up. Okay, boys, put your hands over your heart. Your hand over your heart, and repeat after me. My honored father, my loving mother, thank you so much Thank you so much for not naming me Cecil. Okay, have a seat. Well, Lord Baltimore did name his son Cecil. No, it's not Cecil, it's pronounced Cecil. No, guys, we don't need, of course, okay. Cecil Calvert, he actually didn't go over to the New World either, but he was the guy that coordinated and built the foundation of the colony. Cecil Calvert made it a place for Catholics to freely and openly practice their religion. But when he advertised for colonists, when he was looking for colonists, of course, well, the people that came, because the majority of British people were Anglican, the majority of people that went to Maryland were also Anglican. And it wasn't long before they said, yeah, we don't want to obey this Catholic guy who's in charge. We're good, proud Anglicans. We don't want to listen to that. So they actually set up their own government. The Catholics had a government for Maryland in the city of Baltimore. And in another city, Annapolis, the Protestants set up another government and said, yeah, we'll run the place from here. So there was this friction. But something huge happened, something massive. And that is the Maryland Act of Toleration in the year 1649. The Maryland Act of Toleration, that's a law. The Maryland Act of Toleration made it illegal. The Maryland Act of Toleration made it illegal to discriminate against. The Maryland Act of Toleration made it illegal to discriminate against any Christian. The Maryland Act of Toleration made it illegal to discriminate against any Christian. And again, take off your blinders. Don't say, well, that's so mean to Buddhists. It's a huge, huge step forward. 1649, that is the year that over in England, they're cutting off Charles I's head. That's the very year. That's the very year that they're cutting off the head. The war is beginning in the middle between the Puritans and Charles I Anglican. So this is a rough time over there. And over in Maryland, they're saying, yeah, we're good with each other. Yeah. Biscriminate. Okay, now think about it. When you go into a candle shop, should I look at Chloe and say, before I buy anything, are you a Catholic? No, it's probably not the most important question. If I'm buying candles, should I say, do your candles burn a long time? Do they smell good? Are they pretty? Maybe something like that would be a lot more practical to ask a candle person than, what religion you are. Gotcha.
Will this like be one of our dates?
Will it what?
Will it be one of our dates?
No, you've hit on it twice. I mean, this is when Charles I is being executed. This is when the Maryland Act of Toleration comes around. Talk to me, bud. You're like a little behind. Ask a friend later on. Okay, we're good with Maryland. We can start today's lesson now. You get there a little behind. Yes.
I just have one question. This was the same time as when Texas kept off.
Charles I. Some guy named Larry.
Larry Bird.
Cool. Yeah, let's revisit Virginia. No, I don't want to talk to you. Go away. All right, this is obviously not another colony because this is the first colony. But because it was the first colony, we have to go back and say, all right, what's happened since then? Because you just had little tiny Jamestown up in the swampy area. Then you had Henrico. Then we kind of left it after two little towns. This is the oldest one. This is the most flourishing. This has the biggest population now. Yeah.
What's the heading?
Whatever you would like. They're your notes. Okay. In Virginia, the people who were in charge, the civil leaders, that means in charge of the government and such, were not ministers like they were in New England. The people in charge in Virginia were the plantation owners. There were some people who got a hold of just huge amounts of land, and most of the people lived on their land and paid them rent or worked for them. Those were the people who were in charge. It's kind of like back in Europe, you know, where you had the dukes and the earls, and they had big areas and people worked for them. Sort of the same thing down in Virginia. Now, plantation life. Plantation life, these people were rich. Let me emphasize that. These people were rich. Let me say it one more time. These people were rich. When I went to the Citadel, down in Charleston, South Carolina, when I went to college, one weekend I decided I want to go do the tourist thing because there's so much wonderful history here in Charleston. There are lots of plantations around. And I went to a plantation. It had been a rice plantation. That's what they grew. It was along a river because that's how they moved goods out to sea. But anyway, this rice plantation, you drove down a road, you got to the driveway. The driveway had an avenue of oaks, which means there was probably about, I don't know, maybe an eighth, a quarter of a mile down with these huge, old, beautiful oak trees on each side of the driveway. You drove up there and there was this big, beautiful house. When I'm talking big, beautiful house, I'm talking not quite as big as those houses over across the street in Muirwood, but pretty close. Okay, so these were big, this was a big house. And I went in there and took the tour, and there was a docent, a lady dressed in period costume who took us around and she showed us the house. And the house had, let's see, there was a library room and there was a salon for entertaining. It had a piano and music kind of a room. There was a kitchen that was down a hallway a little bit away from the house because they were very afraid of fire. There were bedrooms upstairs, but they couldn't show us those because this plantation was actually owned by a family whose son went to the College of Charleston, and this is where he was living while he went to college, which is kind of cool. Your dorm room is a plantation. Anyway, took us around and they showed us Slave Street. I'm not being flippant. That's actually what they called it, where they put the little cabins where the slaves had been held. Not very nice, but we went down there and saw that. We saw the wharf where they shipped the rice off from. We finished the tour. We saw all this magnificent plantation. We got back, and she asked if there were any questions, and a couple were asked. And then at the end, she said, "Oh, there's just one more thing. During the Civil War, the main house was burned down. This is the bachelor visitors' quarters." This was an extra house in case unmarried men came to visit them. That's rich. Okay. So these people were rich. Okay. Now we talked about natural rights yesterday, and that was hugely important. The idea that all men are endowed with life, liberty, and property, yet down south they owned slaves. Wow. How did they come by thinking that was okay? Well, I'll tell you. That's going to be a problem all the way from this time until we get to the end of the Civil War, because it doesn't really make sense. Their answer was that they said, well, humans are guaranteed life and liberty. Therefore, in order for us to keep our economics going, black people are not human. That was their solution, because they could argue that and say they're very close. They're very close, but they're not really there. Well, what do they amount to? They were treated as if they were farm animals. So I guess that would be the way they looked on it. Okay. We're going to talk a lot this year about race, slavery, and it is not easy. Right now in your world, oh, it's so easy. All the white people are bad. All the black people are good. All the Southerners were bad. All the Northerners were good. Not true. It's way more complicated than that. First of all, there were groups of people from down south who came up north in the Civil War to fight against slavery. There were groups of people in the north who went down south to fight for slavery. So it's not as simple as that. I want to read you something which will hopefully blow your socks off. All right, listen carefully. The American Revolution was 2 years underway, and John Chavis, a boy of 15, was enlisting in the Continental Army. I mentioned John's service in our war for independence because in later years he would speak of it often and with much pride. It would please him that he's remembered as a patriot. After the shooting had stopped and the states were united, John attended Princeton University, then named Washington Academy. Shortly after the turn of the century, he passed from the role of educator to that of educated to that of educator. Over the next 23 years, he would operate schools in 4 North Carolina counties. Some of his students subsequently became governors, congressmen, diplomats, each doubtless greatly influenced by John's political philosophy. John was an avid anti-abolitionist. An abolitionist was someone who wanted to end slavery. This guy wanted to keep slavery. In an era of arguments on both sides, he wanted the slaves to stay slaves. John held this position not only as a slave owner, which he was, but as a social theorist who claimed the knowledge of what was best for his country. The Africans were lucky to be here under any circumstances, he declared. He expressed a fear of slave uprisings, which might be the result of abolitionist encouragement. Abominable wretches, he called the abolitionists. I would advise Americans to be on the alert for these abominable wretches. In any event, he contended, freedom would be infinitely harder on the slaves than slavery. John was not merely an opinionated Revolutionary War veteran, not just another self-serving slave owner, not only a reactionary educator interested in preserving the established social order, John was a minister. Now let me sketch you a little view of the Presbyterian profile around 1800. The church felt a keen sense of responsibility toward black people. Church authorities deplored slavery, called it a national evil, were eager for the religious and secular education of blacks, yet there was John, a Presbyterian minister, proclaiming the nation's greatest enemy to be abolitionists. Slaves, John insisted, were personal property, period. It was the slave owner's right to do with a slave what he pleased. John said the laws of the land declare that no legislative body shall pass a law to take away the property of a man without paying him. And here I would ask, has Congress the money at hand to pay the slave owners? John was deeply concerned that slavery might end suddenly one day, even more deeply concerned over the tactics of the abolitionists. Because John was both a renowned educator and a widely respected minister, because so many of his flock and friends and former pupils were in positions of influence, John's impact on the national conscience was considerable. John Chavis preached to white men and white women from his pulpit and taught white children in his classrooms the dangers of abolition and the right of free men to own slaves. And this doctrine, which he believed with all his heart, was particularly impressive coming from John Chavis, a Revolutionary War veteran, a learned theologian, a slave owner, a free man, a black man. Yes, he was a black man who owned slaves. In the 1860 census, more than 1,000 black men owned more than 3,000 slaves. So this is not as simple as it seems. So again, take off your blinders. Don't just hear what's coming out of everybody's mouth right now. Think for yourselves. Listen to the things that go on. When they went to a civil war and nearly 1 million people died, each side thought they were right. They weren't thinking, oh, no, we'll just do this for fun. No, they thought they were right in what they believed. Okay, so we got that. We're close enough. We'll call it a day. Spielberg, you can